Sir Roderick Lyne is a former British ambassador to Russia. Welcome to our program, Ambassador Lyne.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
I would like to begin our discussions with Vladimir Putin and his regime. Vladimir Putin is really excited about waging the war against Ukraine, according to the Russian media outlet Medusa. Meanwhile, US President-elect Donald Trump is pressing for a ceasefire in Ukraine as soon as possible. From your perspective, do you feel that Putin's inner circle can allow Vladimir Putin to agree with Trump's proposal on Ukraine with a ceasefire?
Well, I think it's not just Putin's inner circle, it's Putin himself. From the moment of the Orange Revolution, which ended 20 years ago in 10 days' time, on the 23rd of January 2005, Putin, he was deeply humiliated at that time of the Orange Revolution. He had completely miscalculated. He turned against the West from that moment onwards, and he has been driven since 2005 by a determination to gain strategic control of Ukraine, to have the ability to exercise a veto over Ukrainian policy and to limit Ukraine's sovereignty. And throughout this war, Putin has set himself the objective of fighting for as long as necessary to secure the capitulation, the destruction, if you like, of Ukraine. So far, he has not given any indication that he is seriously prepared for negotiations, certainly not in public. So we have to wait and see whether there is a change in Putin's attitude. I'm pretty convinced that the overwhelming majority of people in Russia would like this war to end. It's costing them a lot. 200,000 Russian mothers have lost their sons. Russian wives have lost their husbands. The Russian economy is in trouble, and it's getting worse, and it will continue to get worse. I don't think that Putin cares too much about that, because I don't think Putin cares about his own people. He cares about himself and his grip on power. So Putin, for this war to end, will need to feel that he can present it as some form of victory, some form of justification for the huge costs in blood and treasure which the war has imposed on Russia. And I think that's, his starting point. And we wait to see whether he is willing to enter into a real negotiation.
Do you feel that Russian hardliners can allow Vladimir Putin to settle this war?
Well, Putin is a Russian hardliner. It was Putin's decision to mount the invasion of February 2022. It was a very personal decision. He consulted very few people on it. I think the overwhelming majority of the Russian elite were astonished that he took that decision. They thought that he was using coercive tactics against Ukraine, essentially that he was threatening and bluffing. They did not think that he was going to mount a full-scale invasion. So I think only a very small number of people around the Kremlin and the Russian general staff actually knew that Putin was going to go for a full-scale invasion. So I don't think this is just about Russian hardliners. Obviously, he has grouped around him some people who strongly support what he is doing. But he is the president. He has the power. He started this war. I believe that if Putin himself reached a point where he decided that Russia needed to get out of this war, that he would be able to achieve that. But as I say, he needs to be able to do it in a way which is not a humiliation for him or for Russia. So he will only accept a negotiated ceasefire, and I think a peace settlement, a definitive peace settlement, is a very, very long way off and will not happen while the Putin regime is in power. But a negotiated ceasefire is possible. I wouldn't say necessarily it's probable, but it's possible. But it would, from Putin's point of view, need to be a ceasefire which he can present as some kind of victory. Because the costs of this terrible war, appalling for Ukraine, but they've been very heavy for Russia as well.
Do you feel that Russia and Putin's regime will be able to continue to wage war against Ukraine for another years ahead?
I don't think the war is sustainable indefinitely for Russia. The Russian economy is in real trouble. There are all sorts of issues there. When you have a central bank interest rate of 21%, this is imposing massive costs on Russian enterprises. You've got huge labor shortages because so many Russians have been drawn into the defense industries. They are funding the war by means of getting their banks, not only the state, into debt, but their banks into debt. So the banking system in Russia is now getting quite fragile. And these costs are only going to increase. You can't spend 40% of your budget on defense and security without squeezing your healthcare, your education, your investment in infrastructure, all the things that Russia desperately needs. So the longer this war goes on, the harder it is for Russia. Now, Putin's calculation is that he can force Ukraine to give up, that the Ukraine cannot sustain the war as long as Russia. Well, he may be wrong, because you in Ukraine are fighting a war literally for your existence, your freedom, your sovereignty, and clearly you have the strongest incentive of everybody to see this war end, but not at the cost of your own freedom and your own lives. It's a different calculation in Russia. This is not an existential war for Russia. Russia is not actually under attack. And Russia has the option of ending the war. But this, as I say, depends very much on Putin making a different sort of calculation to the calculation that he's made up to now. As this year goes on, it will become harder and harder for Russia to sustain the war. It is difficult in Ukraine to find enough troops to mobilize more forces, but it's also difficult in Russia. Putin has not dared to order a second mobilization, compulsory mobilization of Russian forces, because when he did that in September of 2022, it was massively unpopular. And he is frightened of doing that again. Why is he having to use North Koreans? That is not a good sign for Russia. It's actually very humiliating for Russia, for Putin to have to go on bended knee to President Kim in North Korea, an utter pariah, and ask for artillery shells and troops. So Putin has got a real problem. He's going to run short of people willing to fight in this war, however much he pays them, and he is running short of tanks, short of other equipment, and short of money. As this year goes on, all of those problems become deeper and deeper for Russia.
But you're confident that the decision on ceasefire in Ukraine will completely depend on Vladimir Putin?
Well, no, it takes two sides to agree to a ceasefire. But when I look at long range at Ukraine's position, there are clearly two elements that are critical for Ukraine if Ukraine is going to be able to accept a ceasefire. One is that Ukraine should retain its full sovereignty, its full freedom of decision-making, freedom of action. And the other, and the most difficult one, is that Ukraine clearly is not going to want to accept a ceasefire unless Ukraine has credible guarantees of its security. A real sense of certainty that it has the means to deter Russia from attacking again. And the sort of measures that would be required to give Ukraine that level of security are measures which Putin, I think, will find very hard to accept. So I think that's the critical point in the negotiation. There are a lot of other things that will be involved, a lot of elements that will be on the table. But the crunch point is Ukraine can't have a ceasefire unless the ceasefire gives Ukraine security and the means to prevent a further attack by Russia. And that would require Putin accepting measures that he, at the moment, I think, is very reluctant to accept.
President Zelensky says that Vladimir Putin is afraid of Donald Trump because Donald Trump has the power to stop the war against Ukraine. Do you also believe in that Putin is afraid of Trump?
I don't know whether he's afraid of Trump, but Trump is a bit of an unknown quantity in a way that gives Trump some leverage. I think Putin is probably a little nervous about what Trump might do. None of us know what Trump is going to do, and I suspect that Trump himself probably doesn't know at this point what he's going to do, although he becomes president now in 7 days' time. But he has a range of options. One of his options, which I hope he will look at very seriously, is to increase pressure on Russia. If Trump is going to go into a negotiation with Putin, and Trump has now talked about the idea of having a meeting with Putin, he needs to have leverage. How does he get that leverage? It seems to me there are two obvious ways that Trump gives himself some leverage in a negotiation. One would be to increase American military support for Ukraine. And the other, and I think really important one, would be to increase the pressure on the Russian economy. The Russian economy is the Achilles heel of Vladimir Putin. It is his weak point. It is in trouble. And there is more that could be done to tighten the sanctions on Russia, particularly the sanctions on the export of oil, but also more secondary sanctions to prevent third countries providing all kinds of services for Russia, supplying equipment to Russia that cannot be supplied directly, providing financial services, trading with Russia in different ways. And I think that the Americans have the power, in combination with the Europeans, to put more economic pressure on Russia. And so if I was advising Trump, I would advise him not to rush into a meeting with Putin, but to make sure that before he had any meeting with Putin, he actually had not only a carrot, but a big stick. And if Trump does that, he might have a chance of persuading Putin to give some ground. But without that, if he just goes into a meeting without that level of preparation, I think the meeting will be a failure.
So do you believe that Donald Trump has enough power to force Vladimir Putin to agree with a ceasefire proposal?
No, I don't think Trump is in a position to force Putin or indeed to force Zelensky. Trump cannot just impose a settlement. Putin would, rather than accept humiliating terms from the Americans, Putin would continue the war. And he has the ability to continue it, although he will find it harder and harder to sustain the current level of hostilities. But he would be very determined not to be humiliated by Donald Trump. He has to be able to claim that he has achieved something in return for this huge loss of Russian life and Russian resources that the war has entailed. So Putin has the ability to say no. Trump does not have the ability to force Putin to accept whatever Trump wants.
even if he sends Ukraine military aid, allows to strike inside Russia, and imposes even tougher sanctions on the Russian economy?
That would increase the pressure on Putin, and I think Trump should do that, because that will give Trump leverage. But it doesn't mean that Putin would, as it were, at that point surrender to Trump. Putin will not surrender to Trump, but it would mean that Trump had a stronger hand to play in a negotiation with Putin. So you can't force Putin, but you need to persuade Putin, and persuade him not by offering him rewards, but by putting more pressure on Putin. That's what Trump needs to do.
But do you believe that it would be possible for Donald Trump to persuade Vladimir Putin about any kind of topic, about a ceasefire? Is it really possible to persuade Vladimir Putin about in any kind of topic?
It's possible. It's not easy. I think it's possible if Putin gets seriously worried that he is not going to make rapid progress in the war, and the progress that the Russians have recently made has been slow, it has not been rapid, and it has been at huge cost in terms of Russian casualties, losing up to 2,000 troops in a single day in order to gain small amounts of territory. And his economy is under extreme pressure. It's not going to collapse, but it's getting worse. And these are factors which will be in Putin's mind. They do give him a reason to look for a way out. It doesn't mean that it forces him to give up, but it does give him an incentive to give up. That's why Trump potentially could have leverage.
How do you see the possible scenario of Putin's endgame, the end of his regime?
There are only three ways his regime could end. One would be if the people close to him mounted a coup against him. That seems to me very unlikely, because he has always been very frightened about his personal security, and he has appointed to all the key positions around himself people who are super loyal to him, but also people who are incriminated in his own corruption and criminality. People who therefore would be vulnerable themselves if Putin fell from power. The second way in which a dictator can be removed from power is if you have a mass revolt of the populace against the dictator. Putin is using such harsh security measures in Russia, murdering and locking up opponents, taking away freedom of expression. It seems very, very unlikely that the Russian people would succeed in rising up against him, and they don't appear to be in a mood to do so. I think they would be frightened of the chaos that would result from that. So, and there is no organized opposition that is even possible in Russia at the moment. So this actually means, sadly means, that the end of the Putin regime has to await the end of Vladimir Putin, who appears to be in good health, is in his early 70s, could live for several more years while his country gets further and further downhill, goes backwards, and weakens, but does not collapse. And I'm afraid that our default assumption must be that Putin will remain in power until the Grim Reaper comes to collect him.
And how do you see the possibility for deputinization after Putin's departure?
The possibility for what?
Of deputinization process.
Deputinization. It will happen. It will happen because Putin has done such damage to his own country. It may not happen immediately. It may not be Putin's immediate successor. I think the most likely successor to Putin will be clearly somebody a bit younger, but somebody who has been groomed by Putin. And critically in Russia, you need to have the support of the security organs, which are immensely powerful. And Putin's successor, therefore, is likely to be somebody from a Putinist orbit. But as you go further down the road, people in Russia are going to realize that Putin has taken the country seriously backwards. You remember that back in 2009, Dmitry Medvedev, who at the time was pretending to be the president of Russia, wrote an article called Go Russia, in which he put the question, should a primitive economy based on raw materials and endemic corruption accompany us into the future? Well, that was 16 years ago. And that's precisely the same question that faces Russia now. And I think that in the post-Putin era, the people of Russia will want once again to modernize their country, to improve their country, not to be seen as a pariah state by the rest of the world, to try to restore a reasonable working relationship with the rest of Europe, to try to be respected in the way that they are not at the moment. In short, they will look back on the Putin era as a disastrous period for Russia that has taken them into this terrible war with Ukraine and that has left them with an economy which still depends heavily on the export of hydrocarbons and other raw materials and on its defense industry, a country which has been remilitarized by Putin, a country in which the standard of living has not improved over the last 10, 12 years, actually has gone backwards. And that's not what the people of Russia will want. So, and they particularly dislike the level of corruption. They're used to corruption in their society. The Soviet Union was deeply corrupt. But the level of corruption under Putin is stratospheric. And I ask myself, has any leader in history stolen more from his people than Putin? And in 20 years' time, that's how the Russians will look back on Putin. At some point between now and then, I think they will make another effort to rejoin the civilized world.
Thank you, Ambassador Lyne, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Well, you're most welcome, and I do wish all the people of Ukraine well. They're going through a terrible period, and I think we in this country and across Europe feel deeply for them and desperately want to see them succeed in this struggle. So thank you very much.